So Nightfall aggro, spiders, pirates, discard aggro. We got scouts, we got sand scouts, we got Azir Noxus, we got Timo Noxus, we got Draven Ez, we got Azir SI, we got Endure aggro. There is a lot, and I still probably miss some. There is a lot of currently viable aggro lists, and the other part of it is it's not that these decks are bad at all. These decks are doing good in winning games. So that's where it's just like how that's so many different aggro lists to have to play against. And me personally, I think aggro has a low skill floor. When I first got into Legends of Runeterra, one of the first decks that I actually crafted was a spiders deck because it seemed good and it was cheap. And guess what? I was able to win so many games with that list because of the fact that it has a low skill floor. What's going on YouTube? It's your boy Optima back with another episode of Hot Take Thursday, and this is going to be the series where we either provide our own hot takes on the Legends of Runeterra meta or use someone else's hot take within the community and provide a breakdown and our own perspective on said hot take. In today's episode, we will be providing our own hot take on one of the most polarizing topics in the Legends of Runeterra community right now, and that's going to be nothing other than aggro. Since we recently got our first patch since the Shurima expansion with a lot of nerfs to some very oppressive champions in the Legends of Runeterra game, it seems like aggro has been one of the main beneficiaries of said nerfs due to the sheer amount of viable aggro decks that are actually within Legends of Runeterra. For better or worse, this seems to be the meta right now, and it seems like aggro is definitely defining the meta, even if it isn't necessarily the absolute best deck right now. In my opinion, I think this is actually for worse. I do not think this is ideal for Legends of Runeterra, especially because what exact decks are rising in prominence to answer the aggro list. This is what today's video is going to be on, so if this sounds like something you will be interested in, I would definitely appreciate it if you watch the entirety of today's video, and if you are new, I would also appreciate it if you got subbed up so you don't miss out on any future episodes of Hot Take Thursday, as well as the other content we have circulating on the channel. But nevertheless, your viewership means the world to me as always, so thank you for watching. Let's get into today's video. Aggro, aggro, aggro. There's obviously so much. If you're playing the game right now, you know there's a ton of it on ladder, there's a ton of it in tournaments. Is this good? Is this bad? I think it's bad for the reasons that I said, for the fact that aggro itself has so many good archetypes, which is an issue considering that there's just a lot of variance that goes on when you play an aggro list. So to play against so many different forms of aggro decks can start to feel a little coin flippy, like you're not fully in control of your destiny and you're kind of playing a little bit of the hoping game, hoping your opponent doesn't have that high roll card early game or this or that. So for it's already an inherent issue for there to be a ton of viable aggro decks in my personal opinion. But then when you factor in as well that some of the other decks that are rising in prominence have very oppressive champions themselves, it even gets a little bit worse, and that's why I wanted to see some of these champions get nerfed. But at the end of the day, I will definitely say this meta is better than what we were experiencing beforehand with Aphelios, Bilgewater, and obviously Tia Fizz, and also even Fiorashin to a certain extent, oppressing the entire meta and disaligning so many archetypes and champions from being playable at all. I'll take this over that any day, but it does not mean that we're still kind of far from a really solid meta due to the way aggro is kind of making everything else around it work. Well, let's just talk about how many aggro decks are at bare minimum C tier deck lists. In my personal opinion, of course, this is all opinionated. Feel free to disagree with any of it, but if you want to disagree, definitely do so in the comment section below. I'd love to get some conversation going with you all. But let's just count them off. We got Nightfall aggro, which is rising in prominence a lot. We got Spiders, which actually has one of, if not the highest win rate in most of the tiers, most of the different tiers right now on ladder. So Nightfall aggro, Spiders, pirates, discard aggro. We got scouts, we got sand scouts, we got Azir Noxus, we got Timo Noxus, we got Draven Ez, we got Azir SI, we got Endure aggro. there is a lot, and I still probably miss some. There is a lot of currently viable aggro lists, and the other part of it is it's not that these decks are bad at all. These decks are doing good in winning games. So that's where it's just like how that's so many different aggro lists to have to play against. And me personally, I think aggro has a low skill floor. When I first got into Legends of Runeterra, one of the first decks that I actually crafted was a Spiders deck because it seemed good and it was cheap. And guess what? I was able to win so many games with that list because of the fact that it has a low skill floor. It is not complex to understand how to use it, which cards to play at any given time, and how to run it in the lower tiers of Legends of Runeterra at all. I know as you get higher, you really can't make mistakes with aggro as much, but I still think most of your plays are still pretty straightforward. That's my opinion. I know some people disagree where they're like, well, you can't mess up at all with aggro when it comes to high tier level play, but I'm still like, it seems like it's easy to avoid mistakes with aggro at those high tiers compared to I know you got more room to make mistakes with control, but it feels like control is just kind of not as in control of things as it would hope against some of these very high rolly aggro lists and just all the different variations of them as well. And yeah, let's go over to Mobalytics and we can even take a look at that. So over here on Mobalytics, we currently have clicked on Masters, Diamond, and Platinum for a ladder. And as you can see, Dravenez is going to be the first list. We then have Spiders. From there, we're going to get into the Nasus Thresh deck that has been very notorious at this point. Really, honestly, pretty surprising to see it this high up. Then we got another variation of Spiders using some different cards that is still higher up. Shurima Overwhelm, but then we got some discard aggro, more of the Nasus Thresh, but this is a different iteration of it. We got some Shin Jarvan, then we get Sand Scouts, some Zoe Asol, but then we get Teemo, Noxus. So that is showing a lot of aggro lists that are doing well on the ladder. And I just think when you compare this to the amount when you compare that to the amount of control or the amount of mid-range or the amount of combo decks that are currently viable, they're nowhere near close. There's an extremely higher amount of aggro lists that are currently viable than those other archetypes. And I think it's a pretty simple answer as to why. I think when you're developing a card game, especially one like Legends of Runeterra, which centers so much around the champions, it is a lot easier to make a low-cost champion that has some type of effect that makes it still like good in later rounds, but still a low-cost champion that has a very aggro kind of playstyle to it than it is to make a control champion that drops turn 6 and still feels worthwhile to play for that much mana, or a mid-range champion that costs 5 but still feels worthwhile to play that costs that much mana. And I think that's showing when you look at some of our six cost champions that we currently have. Lux isn't really currently used. Hecarim's not really finding his place in this meta. Jarvan feels like he's getting there, but still doesn't feel like a great card. And then Karma's really lackluster at times as well, unless she levels, but getting to turn 10 for her to reach Enlightened, to get Enlightened is extremely hard. So I just think for that reason, that's kind of why we're seeing this. It's just a lot easier to design a non-broken aggro cheap cost champion than it is to make a good, viable, non-broken higher cost champion that's either that's either mid-range or control or something along those lines. So it doesn't surprise me, but it doesn't mean that it's definitely not still an issue that we're currently dealing with, especially because once again, I feel like aggro is very coin flippy, which is why we're seeing a lot of people seeking more answers to it than it seems like using it themselves. Because let's actually even just take a look at that. So I can go over to the leaderboards and I can just look at some of the decks that the top people on ladder are currently playing. The person at top is playing what appears to be TF Fizz. Then we got this Demacia Asol Zoe deck that is rising a ton in prevalence. I have some issues with this deck, and I will copy it so that we can go over the issues that I actually have with this deck. This is healing. This can get you Golden Sisters, which is an extremely good healing card. And then 3-star Shapings. it doesn't feel like it on face value, but when you consider the invoke that this deck has, and then how good of a card Zoe actually is that people continue to underrate, it's actually at a point where such an aggro meta you can still make a Ruling Soul work even in such an aggro meta because of the fact that Targon has so much healing. I think it's to a point where it's actually oppressive for a lot of decks, and I know it's mainly oppressive for aggro, but even other decks have a lot of trouble breaking through this. And then if you get a Ruling Soul down, he is still easily one of the best late game finishing cards in the entire game. So it doesn't surprise me that this deck is rising in prominence, and it was an idea that I was actually messing around with at the end of right before we got our most recent patch, for the our first patch for the Shurima expansion. Right before we got that, I was actually messing around with Asol because I thought if you could get him on the field, he was in a very solid place. But I was messing around with more Mimi concepts, unfortunately, that weren't as set and sound as this Demacia Asol deck. So that's just one deck that I think has a little bit too much healing, and it's the whole reason why it's able to stay viable in this current meta. Then we got this Zoe Lee deck, and we will look at this one too. Once again, it's using Eye of the Dragon, which continually gives you the Dragonling, which is just healing on healing on healing. Then it has then this deck has the Deep Meditation, which gives it the spells that it needs, so then it can get Lee Sin on the deck. Pretty much all this deck wants to do is just use Sparklefly and Eye of the Dragon to stay in the game, and then use one of the most oppressive champions since I've been playing Legends of Runeterra in Lee Sin to then win said game, moving forward from there. And I just think, I don't know, this deck really bothers me for the fact that it just seems like it shouldn't work, but it does because of how oppressive Lee Sin is, and because of how underrated Eye of Dragon is at just stalling until you can get Lee Sin on the field, and just the amount of synergy that Eye of the Dragon and Lee Sin have together, especially when you couple in Deep Meditation as well. So just another frustrating oppressive deck that is only viable because Lee Sin is extremely oppressive, especially because he's so well supported by Eye of the Dragon. Then we can go again, and let's see what else we can find. So more of the Demacia Asol stuff. We do have a deep player, which is really cool to see. And then here we go. Here's the other deck that I want to address that seems to be the other deck that can hold its own with all of this aggro that we're current to deal with. And this is none other than TLC, which is Trundle Lissandra Control. And this deck is an issue as well, not because of the removal or anything that it does other than Lissandra getting down this very stupid card in the Watcher, and me still thinking that this card works so poorly and needs a redesign. So it just feels like the only decks that are at the highest level really holding their own with the amount of aggro are Broken Lee Sin, especially when coupled with either Dragon and Zoe. This TLC, which has a late game option of the Watcher, which I just think is so poorly designed and feels very oppressive for a lot of decks, especially decks that are trying to deal with aggro, but then have no answer for the polar opposite of that, which is this TLC Watcher combination. And it just kind of messes up the whole experience where you just can't have an adequate answer for both, all the aggro and this. And then the last one being the Demacia Asol Zoe deck, which once again use Zoe, which is such a good champion, and then is just heal until you drop Asol on the field. So honestly, doesn't work that much differently than the Lee Sin deck, but just uses a slightly less oppressive champion, in my opinion, with Asol than with Lee Sin. Because Asol's so good in the late game, but Asol's just doesn't feel oppressive. Lee Sin feels very oppressive. I would love for these to not be the best decks to answer all the aggro, but because the aggro is so out of control, this is what we get. TLC, Zoe Lee, and Zoe Asol. And it's just unfortunate. This isn't a meta that I'm super fond of, if I'm being honest. And I'm hoping some other decks can definitely rise to be able to combat all this that we're dealing with. Because also, then you have all the aggro, and aggro is still doing extremely well, even with these other answers rising in prominence. In the most recent OLS, and OLS being one of the most consistent tournaments that gets huge turnouts every time they have one, OLS 23 had Salty Simon CG win, and he was running a triple aggro deck list in his win. So it just shows that triple aggro is still super viable, even with these decks that are so focused on trying to combat that. And that's frustrating for me for reasons that I've already said, with the variance of aggro and just with so many good aggro archetypes that you can so easily run triple aggro. But it's also frustrating because I will stand by the point that aggro has a very low skill floor. It just feels like it's easy to learn, to use, and even at the highest level to do well with. So that's just where I lose a little bit of hype when at the highest level triple aggro lists are able to work. It just seems a little anticlimactic, and I want things to be more climatic in Legends of Runeterra, but aggro's the opposite of that. Quick games, doesn't feel like your opponent made any spectacular plays, and even though it's not brain dead, it just generally doesn't feel amazing. So that's just kind of how I feel, and I don't know, it's a little unfortunate, especially for someone like me who doesn't necessarily enjoy aggro and who's trying to build these other decks but just can't have adequate answers for all the aggro and for TLC and for Demacia Asol. It's just so hard to achieve both of those with most decks in Legends of Runeterra. So it's putting us in this box where it's like, hey, either use aggro or use one of these three decks that use oppressive cards but can actually deal with it because of said oppressive cards. Once again, Targon's immense amount of healing, Lee Sin's Broken Self alongside Zoe, or TLC with the very stupid Watcher combo. So yeah, I'm not super enthused about where the meta currently is, but it still is night and day compared to what we had beforehand with the Aphelios Bilge, with the TF Fizz, and with even Fiora Shin. I will take this meta over that any day because those were extremely oppressive, but I still think that we got some ways to go to get to a truly really solid meta. But nevertheless, I think that pretty much covers everything I wanted to say on aggro in this video. So I appreciate once again any of you guys watching this video and sticking with me for the entire ride of it. It means a lot. And yeah, I hope to see you guys in the next Hot Take Thursday. For now though, that's going to be it for me. Peace out.